Greetings and welcome back to another discussion, and I can assure you this discussion is very timely and very important. I've had my friend on before. He's a YouTube consultant, among other things, and we're here to talk about effectively the handing over of various platforms created by effectively non-left-wing individuals and organizations over to the current state of affairs, and we all know it's dominated by left, if not far left, thinking, and to see how that transpired and what came to pass, in addition to discussing the current YouTube situation, because the YouTube situation always changes after a couple of months, or certainly after a year or so. So let me thank my friend for joining me, and I'm going to hand over the platform to him for the time being.
Thank you. Pleasure as always, and pleasure for the kind words you have about me. Diving right into it, I think the biggest barometer of what's going on these days is that, in reality, tech and social media companies, for perhaps right reasons, are extremely unpopular, especially in the areas of the internet we hang out with. And by far, the biggest indicator of that is it's openly discussed that people want the U.S. government. Most tech companies, internet companies, and social media companies are based in the United States. People want the United States government to step in and regulate the internet because they feel like there's a disproportionality between which kind of content creators and people speaking out are deplatformed versus others. Now, roll that all the way back to a time period we're going to be talking about a lot, I would say, over the remainder of this talk, and that is, the older days of the internet when things like WikiLeaks were the bastion of keeping the government out of the internet. That was the big campaign. Back in the day, whether it was anti-NDAA, anti-SOPA, anti-CISPA, or all the other numerous things that have tried to regulate the internet through various mechanisms, the most recent one being Article 13. But you could see back then, these tech and social media companies were, the bastion of, opposing the government, which was seen as the enemy of free expression and freedom on the internet. But now it's reversed, right? The government is seen by some people, not everyone, but the government is seen as the savior, and people are extremely, extremely upset with social media. And probably the best place to start looking at this company by company, I would say, is Reddit, if you're interested in talking about that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so Reddit had a brief period where it supplanted Dig, or it surpassed Dig, I should say, and to use a term from Mr. Medicare, it was part of the Wild West era of the internet, and so it was founded by three people, but probably the most useful one to talk about for this talk is Aaron Swartz. I think he's one of these guys to really simplify a really brilliant guy's life. He's kind of like one of these internet almost total freedom of speech, freedom of information guys. I would almost say it might be risky to say this, but crypto anarchists, that kind of stuff. But really, at the end of the day, he believed in freedom of information at all costs.
Just a brief question: if I recall, Schwartz was most active in the early 10s. No, okay, something like that.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely. He died in 2013.
Right. Right. Under mysterious circumstances, right?
Was it? I don't know if it was mysterious. I thought he committed suicide because of the court case against him was a lot of people I saw commenting at the time. The case against him, I think, was, or at least other people think it was massive prosecutorial overstepping, and so he committed suicide because of it. But you can see this is part of a broader trend where the original guys who found companies like this, and you'll see this over the next ones we talk about, the original guys who found companies like this, they're kind of just out because, they want to do it because, tech is cool, or they have, ideas usually that are far more populist or, not as...
more neutral at the very least, yeah. More neutral.
Or at the very least neutral, like you'll see the early days of YouTube. Yeah, I mean... I would say early on, it varies company by company. Reddit's case, I would say at least they're more neutral, or in Aaron Schwartz's case, radical belief in freedom of information. And in YouTube's case earlier on, by far just neutrality, looking to provide a platform to provide videos to people and not really looking to take a stance on much of anything. It changed over time, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So in Reddit's case, it was acquired by Condé Nast fairly early on, and after the the death of Aaron Swartz and then the departure of all the original founders, that's when you started seeing really authoritarian style CEO stepping in. So there was a CEO. Her name was Ellen Pao. I don't know if people remember her. She was extremely unpopular for content controls and censorship measures. And now the current CEO, I think his last name is Huffman. He does the same thing. But you'll notice when money comes in, like a lot of these companies, they start off small. They're just established by tech savvy guys and the dorm room stereotype. And then as soon as you notice, every single time, as soon as big money comes in, the tone and the demeanor of the management of the sites radically change. And so Condé Nast, which purchased Reddit, is a subsidiary itself of something called Advanced Publication. And so you can see the people who are on the board of directors of these companies or founders of these companies, and as you can imagine, they're big money interest. You can look into yourself, but this is a general trend you've seen over the past 10 years, where when the internet was in its infancy, the only people interested in pioneering on it were these kind of guys, and then when big money came, so did like big mainstream controlling politics along with it. And I think Reddit is the greatest example where the general trend is when big money comes into companies, internet companies, social media companies, the founders, the original founder guys get ousted or replaced or sent out. Well, in Reddit's case, the original guys who established the ideas that protected, the early internet Wild West culture, he literally died in that case. So, whether through death or replacement or ousting, this is the trend across every single company. There's not much more to say about Reddit these days. I mean, so for example, the Donald Trump Reddit is openly admitted to be censored. Like, it can't appear on the home page. They just don't let it appear on the home page.
In addition, in light of some of the events regarding the sort of incel phenomenon, I think it was reinstated, or at least they created a new one. There was an incel Reddit that got shut down too, if I recall right. Twice. Okay.
Twice. Yeah. They don't allow the incel Reddit subreddit to operate. Right. You can, project whatever reason you want to be on that, but people aren't stupid. They notice a pattern. They notice a pattern of which ones get shut down and which ones don't, and they're playing a fine line because internet social media companies are very, very consumer facing. They're very much at the mercy, or at least they were earlier on, of their users. But as the sites monopolize and competition becomes harder and harder, imagine that these sites become more authoritarian as that progresses.
Even harmless Reddit, such as Overwatch, if you have too much of an opinion, it's very easy to get censored there. If your opinion runs counter to the snowflakes there. Yeah, I mean, I don't really post on Reddit myself. I don't see the point really, because anything I'd have to say, if it's not basically not towing the line, it would be censored or removed or whatever. When I used to post on Reddit on occasion on various topics, really any sort of disagreement that's regarded as too vehement tends to get locked down, so I just don't bother.
Yeah, that's another topic, and that's kind of falling into positivity cultism. People don't really like confrontation, it seems, especially on the internet, are things that are about games or distractions. What you're talking about in the Overwatch subreddit is something that's consciously done by these companies, by their management, and they kind of create a climate of conformity. So they crack down on people, and then everyone else kind of double guesses or double checks what they're doing, and so then they naturally conform without it's the equivalent of not having to send a policeman to every single door to break it down to arrest people. You just need to arrest a few people, and the rest fall in line. It's the same principle with these websites too. So in the case of the Overwatch subreddit, I doubt the management of Reddit has necessarily done anything, but naturally the climate of fear and conformity causes them to act that way. Whereas in the past, I remember there were subreddits about other games. I think this is going to make me seem like a video game plebeian, but Halo, among other things, and it was a wild west. It was a wild west. People said whatever they want. It was really incredible, and I'm sure people listening definitely think back fondly of the days on the internet from 2010 or even 2008 or those earlier times. It was very, very different, and that's the point of this. It's a history lesson of how social media companies didn't used to be this unpopular and this hated, and I think this is a natural time to transition to, how money and how companies being bought out ruined YouTube too. If you still have anything to say about Reddit, otherwise we can move on.
But I've been actually done with Reddit in terms of my interaction with the platform for years, and definitely.
Yeah, I think we're all done with Reddit, so to speak. At least everything that everywhere you want to talk about. I've had so many subreddits that I either was aware of or mildly interested in get shut down. I'm done with that site. It's so dumb. YouTube, though, people know the story, and we've definitely talked about this on previous talks. Founded by 3 former PayPal employees. This is a common theme you'll see across these social media companies, whether Peter Thiel investing in Facebook or the 3 PayPal employees creating YouTube. You can read their bios. They're just, I wouldn't say they were as ideological as Aaron Schwartz, but they were just guys looking to create tech. You can see how, they're developing the, innovative models and systems behind PayPal. They do the same thing on YouTube. You can read their bio, and they'll say one is most known for pioneering anti-fraud programs on the internet that were also implemented on YouTube. One of them is, the chief technology officer of YouTube, and he had experience on a video sharing app called Mixbit, among other things. And you'll notice these guys' backgrounds are actually in technology. And if you compare that to the current CEO of YouTube, which I think we haven't spoken of fondly many times before, she doesn't really have much of a tech background among her other failings.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what her... I know she attended Harvard, which, whatever that means. Right.
English.
And, yeah, and yet, and so odd. She seems so inarticulate when she speaks. You'd think somebody with an English degree from Harvard would sound a little bit different from a Valley girl in her late 40s. But hey, what do I know?
Yeah, and obviously, these guys are probably connected to the big money circuit, right? They came from PayPal or everything, but I can speak anecdotally and say, to their credit, YouTube was not perfect back then. I think by far their biggest problem was communication. It still is today. But, and actually, no, by far their biggest problem were people abusing the system. So if you guys remember false DMCA claims, among other things. But it still, maybe it felt like, the company was a little bit large and clumsy, but it never felt like it was actively looking to exterminate you. Which I think many people listening can now attest to, that it certainly feels that right now. Many people who make videos are wondering, when am I going to get an email? When am I going to wake up and get a cryptic email that everything I'm doing on YouTube is over? That's what's happening right now. And, before then, maybe your biggest threat was from some system failing or something like that. But I wouldn't say it was a concerted effort. And so that's illustrative of, Google's money coming in, buying out the company, replacing the techie guys that create it, who are just, again, more about, creation, the technology itself, or in, God forbid, bringing value to shareholders, which is something I like to harp on over and over, and then replacing it with ideology. So, for example, this is a good transition to a topic I'd like to bring up, and that is how these big money companies and finance investors use subsidiaries to essentially sidestep fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. And I can go into that next, but if you'd like to say anything about, the early days of YouTube or the founding of YouTube, we can do that before I move on.
It's curious, though, a little bit, the trend of tech founders that it seems, and maybe this is just a general creative phenomenon in the hearts and minds of men, that they create something and tend to just want to move on rather than work on it and perfect it. And that's not always the case, but certainly in the case of some of these tech platforms, that seems to have been, historically speaking, the case, that they devise something, it runs decently, and then they try to cash out and just move on. I was wondering, it just makes me wonder what really is behind that. Maybe it's just too much work.
You have to talk to each individual person, but that's just a natural thing people do when they create something, and after years the passion dies out. There are other things that work here too. You can be technologically sophisticated, but in reality, entrepreneurship and startups, they run on money.
Yeah.
And guess what? Money's all concentrated in the Bay Area, California, Silicon Valley, New York.
there's an analogy actually in the gaming world. Everyone knows the reputation that EA has and Bioware has, which is basically, well, EA is regarded as the worst publisher on earth for games. Bioware is regarded as a fallen angel that's fallen into a puddle of mud and feces. And it's interesting because Bioware started by guys who had nothing to do with games. They originally were they were involved in tech, but they wanted to create software and hardware for hospitals to improve health monitoring. And for some reason, they fell into it, and they were really passionate about it. And eventually, they just lost the passion. And this loss of passion on the part of the founders of BioWare roughly correlates with what people who know games like Mass Effect, Dragon Age, all the sort of classics, KOTOR, this correlates with the decay, if you will, and the disintegration of the quality of those types of games into just piles of trash, largely. I mean, I don't need to go in here what happened to Mass Effect Andromeda. So it seems that people lose even in the gaming world, their passion, and they just cash out. And these guys have gone on record, the founders of BioWare, saying, we're just not interested. We're done with this. We're done with the gaming genre. And so it's open-ended to see what's going to happen. But needless to say, BioWare today has almost nothing to do with BioWare from 10 years ago. So
that's interesting, too, because you mentioned that their foray into games was effectively a fling or a whim. Is that fair to say?
Coincidental. They just thought it sounded interesting. They had an idea and a passion. And I mean, many of you might know Baldur's Gate, right? Baldur's Gate 2, that's regarded as a classic RPG. Anyone who's played the RPG genre would know about it. They were behind it. They threw whatever money they had at it, which wasn't a lot at the time, and it turned out to be a hit. And I'd say for a good 10 or even 12 years, they had a passion for RPG game design and really were into that. But eventually that died down, and it's just undeniable. I'm not saying it's causative, but highly correlative to see that BioWare, which used to be the most beloved RPG company on the planet, turned into just a complete shit show, either in terms of just RPGs being watered down, catering to SJWs, for many people might know. In the third part of the Dragon Age series, which is a fantasy RPG, there was, instructions in education on transgenderism, almost pushing the agenda of homosexuality, if you will. And I remember there were quote unquote straight male gamers, which is the majority or had been, being told that it was time for them to wait in line. It was their time to receive the punishment that women and fringe minorities had suffered through for a very long time. This hadn't been the case in the years of innovation, and people were just trying. Those people, and I can't recall their names off the top of my head, but wanted to make high quality RPGs, which at times were politically incorrect. This wasn't relevant. The story was relevant, and making compelling stories. And over time, all this stuff got injected into it. And who knows how the agenda crept into BioWare specifically, but needless to say, it distracted from and detracted from the quality of the games. And now BioWare is an ash heap, and nobody of sound mind and decent thought trusts them to make a good RPG, apart from, and this is how bad it got with them. It's a bit of a tangent, but it's related, that allowing these fringe elements to take over, even the fringe elements were disappointed with Mass Effect Andromeda. They liked the quote-unquote inclusion where everyone is a trisexual, I like to have sex with pigs, whatever it is these days, I lose track. But from the technical standpoint, they were very critical. And it just goes to show that, as I like to say, you give them an inch, they don't take a mile, they take leagues. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but this is basically
no, it's not at all a tangent.
Yeah, but I think
It's not
it's
at all tangent because you observe that over and over and over. The
yep.
ironic thing is that, guys who start off or whoever starts off making these things, they have less money, but they seem to be
Yeah,
more concerned about it than
that's
when
right,
the
because
big money comes in, they care about ideology.
The founders of
Ironic, isn't it?
Bioware threw whatever money they had into it. I mean, they weren't going to go bust, but it was pretty close just to make these games out of passion. Turned out they were successful, and then money gets involved. I mean, everyone knows about EA. I mean, EA has had this. Not only have been voted consistently the worst gaming publisher company in the world, but sometimes the worst, as in not toothpaste companies do better than they do. And on top of that, the microtransaction thing. I mean, that's another can of worms. But I think you had actually initially played Star Wars, if I recall right, and you just dropped it because you noticed that the most recent release, I think it was when was that released, and that had just turned to shit because of the microtransactions, where you couldn't compete because somebody, I'm just making this, could drop a cool 20 or 50
This was Battlefront, yeah.
Battlefront on the next laser cannon that would blow you into oblivion. And I mean, they were called out on that because it was so extreme, but they're still going to get away with it long term, I think, because people are going to pay for that shit. And it's just what happens when money overshadows the original innovation, creativity, and passion that goes into these things. And it seems to be an inevitable cycle. Long term, I don't see many good prospects, anyone developing these platforms. And people talk about CD Projekt Red, who created The Witcher 3. They're working on Cyberpunk. There might be some hope for them because they operate independently. They do have, obviously, shareholders, but they're their own bosses. They are the publishers in charge. They have the GOG platform, et cetera, et cetera. And that might act as a long-term buffer barrier to the kind of corruption we've witnessed throughout, whether it's Bethesda, Bioware, Activision, Ubisoft, you name it. It's I think it's just par for the course at this stage. Yeah.
This is actually a perfect time to introduce how, out of all things, and no one would really think this, corporate structure actually affects what's going on here. So you mentioned CD Projekt Red, and you say, yeah, they have shareholders, but see, that's the difference, right? They're responsible to their shareholders, whereas a company like Reddit or Vice or whatever, guess who they report to? They report to their parent company. That's not a shareholder. I mean, the people in the parent company can say whatever, do this, do that, or as long as they're happy, it's fine.
Absolutely, and on top of that, I mean, I don't know how true this is. They've gone on record to say sometimes they will flout shareholder interests in favor of player interests because they want to be devoted to the player base. They know ultimately the best customers are satisfied, devoted customers who respect the developer and the publisher. And there have been cases apparently where the shareholders weren't too thrilled with their decision, but they still stick with them long term because they know that's a winning strategy for developing trust, consistent funds. Because I don't know anyone. The next project they're working on, Cyberpunk 2077, whilst there's some skeptics, everyone's going to get the game. I mean, nobody has. I mean, it's a faith-based proposition, but we know their track record, so nobody's thinking, I don't know if I'm going to get this game. I'm going to wait for reviews. 90% of people who know their work are going to get the game. And long term, that just translates into good profit. And even if you have a shareholder who thinks that that's not the right methodology, they say screw them because most of them know that's what's going to create the consistency, right?
Right. I think it's important to differentiate here. I finally reached the conclusion after all these years, these, at least the non-publicly traded social media companies, I don't think they care about money anymore. Or
that's my.
I don't think money is important
we've talked
at all.
about this. Yeah, I don't think they do either. I think that, I mean, in the case of YouTube, there was before she who shall not be named, SW, we'll call her. SW took over. There was another gentleman who seemed to be pretty detached from a lot of these political motivations.
That is extremely accurate.
Yeah, and was more interested in things like fiduciary responsibility or just profit. It's not that companies have never in past eras pushed an agenda beyond the profit model. There were a couple that had sort of conservative, traditional things they wanted to push, but it's at the stage now where ideology does seem to be more important than turning a profit. And even, I mean, this is speculative, obviously. People have said for years YouTube doesn't turn a profit, it's not profitable, but it's such a massive platform, and it's such a massive ideological platform, and would effectively, I hate to use this term because it's so hackneyed and cliche, but the culture war, which is a real thing in many ways, the culture war, it's a battleground for the culture war, and the people on the left who want to make sure that they're in charge and want to win it, come hell or high water, that's going to happen, and at the cost of profit, at the cost of making money, which must be the case, even though we're not privy to the exact details.
Yeah. So, for example, in the Soviet Union, I know this is a cliche comparison to draw, but you'll have to bear with me. There was really only 3 television channels, if I remember correctly, and pretty much the only one, or at least the biggest one, was Channel 1, which was not really even a business per se. It directly reported to the Communist Party, and as a result, it reflected the mainstream consensus of what the party wanted. YouTube is the only real, in effect, video sharing website. It's obviously, in my opinion, not always working for the benefit of its shareholders, and it's working to just reflect the mainstream left corporate consciousness. What's the difference there? I mean, yeah, it's reporting to private people, but they're in the political cast, the people they ultimately report to. I'm talking about the big finance that buys it out, whether it be Google or the various investment firms. I don't see a difference, especially if they're acting this way. One question I want to pose is, so something different is at play here than what used to be at play in the past. And so, we would all know in the the mid 2000s, during the Bush years or whatever, and ExxonMobil would have scandal after scandal. So would Chevron or British Petroleum, but they would still have corporate, I would call it corporate propaganda, but it was corporate responsibility. Like every big company has it on their website where they're saying, oh, we're about ethics and blah blah blah. So Exxon will have a commercial where they're planting trees, meanwhile pulling countless tons of crude out of the ground and causing whatever havoc and destruction. There's that kind of posturing, right? But then compare that to YouTube's posturing. There's a clear difference between that.
Well, I wanted to bring up.
If you see what I'm catching on.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to bring up a similar example, which is the sugar industry, something like Coca-Cola. I mean, they lie through their teeth and have done for decades. However, they're not doing it to be ideologues. They still have they're not even at the stage pretending it's healthy. They'll sort of deny the negative consequences of sugar consumption. And what's interesting about that too is that, yeah, again, they're lying through their teeth to turn a profit. They're not ideologically motivated. They got in bed. I mean, for example, the anti-fat campaign, which we're still recovering from, and arguably it's still ongoing, that emerged in the 60s and 70s and really took hold and took foot in the 80s and 90s in extremis. They were collaborators in that, and so there were ideological elements, but they weren't pushing it because they were ideologues themselves. They were just greedy, dishonest bastards that didn't care about poisoning the population, which is at least a reliable factor. It's a kind of, yeah, we know these types, right?
It's the enemy,
The enemy, but with things like Google, YouTube, and various other platforms, they don't give a shit about that. They're not lying through their teeth or engaging in mendacious, deceptive techniques because they want to make money. They're doing it because they're trying to. Let's face it, the internet is the platform where you can speak your mind. There's tons of things you just don't say in quote unquote polite company. And
certainly not on cable either.
Right, exactly. And as a consequence, it really gets the noggin jogging. But yeah, I would rather deal with people like Coca-Cola and Pepsi and the people who make Skittles and Dunkin' Donut, because I know why they're lying and why at least they're lying through omission at times. Whereas the willy-nilliness, to make use of a neologism there, and the randomness of YouTube and other platforms. I'll take the example. You're familiar with my audience. Why was my channel not entirely demonetized? And I'm not talking about the traditional videos went from green to yellow requesting a review, but just grayed out. There's just no money from AdSense there anymore. They didn't exactly tell me why. It was completely vague. They don't tell me how to correct it. And whilst it's indeterminable whether or not there was an ideological motivation behind that, it's highly suspect and probably even likely considering the trends on YouTube. And yeah, this is really, I think, the fundamental difference. Even if there are analogs in the past between companies that were pushing seemingly an agenda like Coca-Cola or breakfast cereals, which are some of the worst things you can consume, where they say it's really healthy first part of the day, don't miss your breakfast. We're talking about cornflakes that are between 90 and 100 on a glycemic index that are going to shoot your insulin levels through the roof. Sure, but they're not doing it because they have some fundamental belief in creating new diabetes patients. They don't care about creating new diabetes patients, but they're doing it because they want to make money, and so they will lie. And I'd rather deal with that because it's a reliable, predictable factor. So for example, let's say you're waging a war of truth and facts against the sugar industry. Well, you know where they're going to pivot, you know where they're going to make their move, you know what they're going to oppose. Whereas it's just so random, and it always gets escalated. Of course, dealing with left-wing media, there's no way to really predict what's permissible and what's not. Right? This is what I prefer about your typical greedy, deceptive company. If you speak ill about Skittles or Kellogg's cornflakes or whatever, then they won't like that. But with YouTube, whether you're being obtuse or not, if you just say something, the cloud is green for whatever reason, there's some new trend about how people identify with actually being green-skinned, or I'm making this up obviously, but it's not unthinkable given the insanity we live in these days, that will be viewed as a pernicious thought and something to be put down. It's the new Wild West, except it's the Wild West with a bunch of people armed with machine guns who will shoot you down if they want.
Yeah, but I mean, those companies, if we're talking about like Skittles, Coca-Cola, or across different industries, in theory, they're competing with each other. With these tech companies, these social media companies, it's so weird that all the bannings and deplatformings happen the same time on every single social media website. That's so weird. You would think there would be some kind of incentive. If people get thrown off of one platform, the other one would, welcome them with open arms. So they'll say, "Oh, hey, come over here." If they weren't, not all cut from the same cloth. But that doesn't happen. What you were getting at before about just normal corporate greed or corporate lying. It's the difference between apathy to the consequences and antipathy to undesirables in the case of social media. And, it's really funny, you can still think back to more sane times. Like, so for example, with your demonetization and the vague language around it, the funny thing is it's not vague exactly how you sign up for YouTube Red, how you pay for YouTube Red. That's pretty clear cut and easy to understand. But it's really incredibly vague as to what happens with all these people being demonetized or shut down or whatever. Like, you can't really figure out the reason why. But no, it's pretty obvious how to send them money. And that's no accident, right? I can't attribute that to incompetence. I can't, because I know plenty of people. I talk to them. They reach out, they email YouTube. They're stonewalled. They have meetings. They talk about this stuff. They know they're intentionally stonewalling people. They know that the rules and reasons for bannings and demonetizations and shadow banning. They know it's all intentionally vague. I mean, they're not vague about the social causes they support. That's pretty obvious. They're not vague about how to give them money. I mean, it's not vague how you pay your rent or pay your gas bill. I mean, nothing in business, if it comes down to sending them money, it's not vague.
Oh yeah,
this is something different.
Yeah, you can just count on them. whether
They
it's
won't let you forget either. They'll remind you.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But this is
they'll think for you even.
Yeah, this is a completely new can of worms, and that's why this really is, I think, a first in business interactions with the public. And I've been thinking for a long time that the only counter to something like YouTube is, or any of these platforms, is somebody with enormous and massive, and by that I mean billions upon billions of dollars to erect something. But we don't know if that wouldn't last either, based on how things have been going. If you got a neutral party to create some competitive platform, what would safeguard that against the takeover we've seen in the past? I mean, even if it's not neutral, even if it has sort of right-leaning tendencies, you would have to be constantly vigilant. And I don't know, just that's I guess the real issue at hand is that we're all sort of up the creek without a paddle, and there's no way out, because every alternative is just more than degrees worse than YouTube in terms of reaching an audience, in terms of getting your ideas out there. And I'm an idea guy, as you know, as everybody knows, and it's important to get ideas out there. And if you're going to go to a different platform where the potential is 95% reduced, that's not very effective. And so we're basically stuck. And this is the thing. It's referencing the Soviet Union again. The people who lived in the Soviet Union were just stuck with it. They didn't have a choice. They tried to circumnavigate certain things. I mean, it's the old joke, nobody really trusts Pravda, whatever. They had their own sort of things like that. But what can you functionally do when you're dependent on a platform that visibly, audibly, and just obviously is against your existence because you don't think it's a particularly useful idea to teach 6 and 7-year-olds about, I've lost track of the acronyms, LGBTI, Y, X, Z, Z, something, right?
No. What's the difference between how life is on the internet now and life in East Germany? I mean, that's an honest question. You have one platform, people disappear without an explanation or a notice, climate of fear. I'm not saying, East Germany was the worst place in the world or it was the best place in the world. I'm just saying, what's the difference between how it's governed?
Yeah, I
or
suppose
the Soviet Union? I don't see the difference.
I suppose a second world satellite state might be a better analogy than actually, because there's the pretense. Yeah. It's not actually part of the Soviet Union. So if you were in Poland or Hungary, yeah, I mean you're quote unquote your own country, but you're not really. It's not like the Libertarian Party would be given a fair shot in quote unquote elections or what have you during the Cold War, and I guess that makes it all the more sinister, because the pretense is there, and they're not going to officially go on record saying we're against X people. It's just going to be implied to the point where it's mind-blowingly obvious to everybody involved. And
that's the most frustrating part. It's so incredibly opaque.
Yeah.
In this case, it's operating by the vector of big money, but nobody knows really what's going on or why they do it. Why do you think there are so many competing conspiracy theories for why these companies seemingly act so, irrational when it comes to maximizing profits? People say, oh, it's, so-and-so secret society. Oh, it's the government taking over everything. All these conspiracy theories, all that shows is, these, big money institutions, big money companies, all these people buying out the social media companies, they're not acting according to the profit motive. That's a fact. And so as a result, because everyone's so confused about it, no one knows what's really going on, they attribute all these conspiracy theories to it. And I'm not saying any of them are right or wrong, but you can, at a minimum, confirm that because of just how opaque and seemingly irrational the entire enterprise is, whether it's Reddit, YouTube, or whatever, you have to wonder what's going on. And to tender my theory, I think at the end of the day, when you get to a certain amount of money, it's not about the number in your bank account anymore. I mean, who really has more power? a guy with $1 billion in his bank account, or the, like, in the equivalent of, I'm going to use East Germany as an example, the guy who controls the only tolerated TV station or the only tolerated radio station. I mean, that's the real power to get
Even
people
if
to bend to what you
even
want.
if he practically functionally has less money in the bank, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That person exercises more control over people than a guy with a big number in his bank account. And, I think, money used to be a good proxy for, and still is obviously, but even more so in the past, used to be a big proxy for, like, control and prestige of status over people. But you can do that without money too. It's been demonstrated in all the Eastern Bloc countries, all the quote unquote non-capitalist countries out there. And that's my theory about what's going on. I think, some people realize, like, yeah, big bank account's nice, but I want total control over what people think and what people say.
Yeah. Of course, I guess I don't want to steel man these companies too much, but the idea, of course, or the claim, the counterclaim to just about everything we've been discussing has always been, well, it's a private company, it can do what it wants. And that is well, it's technically true. If you're, it's technically regarded as a privilege to be, if you're on some forum owned by a company and you say something unsavory and they don't want you, then, yeah. So, in a technical sense, that's true. But simultaneously, it does nothing to change the fact that it's obvious they're incredibly motivated by ideology in a way that is just highly abnormal and deviant from the operating factors with any other company, be it a shoe manufacturer, clothing manufacturer, the sugar industry. They all, they might have interest in the products they're peddling, but at the end of the day, it's about making money with product X. And that's why this is a first, although I don't really have a good counter argument. Yeah, YouTube can, in theory, do whatever the hell it wants. At the same time, it's interesting how they have rules and guidelines, obviously, and there's some things that people on YouTube dare not say for obvious reasons. And if they do, well, you know what happens. But they also go out of their way to sort of smokescreen the whole situation and claim that they're not doing that sort of thing. It's a bit odd. Just like Soviet satellite states, again.
Yeah, that's a classic tactic. In a different era, you would have been, discreetly or very obviously informed of what's going on. But now, it's also subtle, and I would call it passive aggressive. One person wakes up and is like, "Oh, my views are really down. That's so weird." No explanation. And then you find out months later, some new machine learning whatever is targeting your stuff, and now it's not letting you see people, or videos aren't going out to all your subs, or you get demonetized for cryptic reasons. One thing you were getting at before is just like this broad thing where you're saying that private companies can do whatever they want, blah blah blah. And I think broadly I agree. And also I'd like to say that, for the record, I think old corporate culture is dead. It's not about maximizing profits anymore. At least not on like the super big money cast of people. I think that's dead completely.
Well,
that's say something.
Yeah, because that feeds into essentially a different, life philosophy. People who run companies, obviously, they want to be typically or traditionally want to be successful. They want to make sure they satisfy the shareholders. Companies turning a profit, and the control factor, exerting control over markets, only is relevant in as much as they might want to, like, say, Bill Gates and Microsoft, although he's not too directly involved in that anymore. But creating a monopoly to dominate a certain line of products is the one thing. Even if Windows is a shit operating system, for example, they didn't try to squeeze out competitors for the sake of some ideological reason, right? And there were the limits of, basically I'm saying is there were limits on the amount of control they wanted to exert. It was really limited to the product. So if some toothpaste company managed to squeeze out, no pun intended, every other toothpaste competitor, well, they're not doing it to promote some weird ideological agenda. They're doing it because that ensures that they're going to be selling all the toothpaste. And VP
guy number 35 gets his second yacht.
Right.
That's about the end of it.
Right. that's the critical difference here. Where, as you pointed out, it's actually more profitable, in air quotes, to control all the relevant social media platforms, to maintain a narrative, and to get rid of people that oppose them. And I feel that people who are deviant from what is now becoming pretty normalized, we're sort of gnats, mosquitoes poking at a problem. I don't really see a way out. But there is a positive note here, or a silver lining, if you will. I was recently in a conversation with a gentleman who, within his late 20s, and had spent a considerable amount of time in the military, and then had transitioned to professional security. If I recall, a lot of his work involved guarding private ships in troubled areas, like off the coast of Somalia and what have you. And the consequence, I listened to what he had to say. He was very kind of like a fuck idiot, a subject idiot. He was very focused on his work. But all the stuff I was telling him about James Damore, basically the transformation that had taken place in the United States, was completely alien to him. I mean, he was, how should I put it? He was genuinely flabbergasted when I posited the idea.
It's like he was in a coma?
He was in a kind of cultural coma, yeah, because he had spent all his years fighting insurgents in Afghanistan, Iraq, and then shooting Somali pirates. That when he came, he's still unaware because his work is just completely irrelevant. Now, there are 2 points I want to make here on the one related to this. On the one hand, a guy like that, the security operator, it's all about efficiency. He did the whole. What about the issue with, if you're a man, you better be scared to death if you're going to be working with women in the office? Everyone knows that's a acute danger if you're a male, of whatever stature. If you're
even Mike Pence, he refuses to be alone in the same room with one of them.
Right,
it's a reality. Vice president, he can't escape it. No matter how powerful you are, you can't escape it.
If you're low SMV male, nobody gives a shit about you to begin with, but you'd be an easy scapegoat. If you're a high SMV male, well, there are all kinds of other dangers that are involved with that. And he was just in a state of shock that companies don't care about efficiency anymore, because in his line of work, you're either efficient or you're dead. And obviously there are no women working in security forces of that sort. So he doesn't have to deal with that either. But he sounded extremely naive. He says, well, what's wrong with people being able to express their opinions and views? Nothing wrong with that, as long as they're not pushing on people.
That's the question I asked, yeah.
As long as they're not pushing on people. This kind of old school, some semi-constitutionalist naivete that you could only find in someone who spent his entire young adult life in combat situations where none of this could matter, because if it did, you'd be dead. Basically caring about some of these fringe elements and these fringe ideologies. And it just showed the disconnect between anyone who works a normal job or a job on YouTube or whatever, and somebody actually doing work where the accountability is literally life or death. So I suppose the silver lining there is that in the work that matters most, that is life or death, this stuff has not penetrated, at least to the degree where it's noticeable, apparently. But on the other hand, it shows that just how warped mainstream normal society has become.
That is 100% truth. A massive transformation has taken place.
Yeah,
you can't deny it. I mean, actually, it's very good timing. You talk to somebody, as you put it, was literally in a cultural coma. I mean, that's incredibly validating, I would say, for what we're saying.
Yeah, I was a bit shocked.
I do want to touch on something, before about, this will be brief, then we can move on, private companies being able to do whatever they want. I'm not saying, the legal system is exactly entirely reliable and robust, but this is a 2005 line of speaking, but, companies have a legal responsibility to maximize returns to shareholders. That's a fact. And you can go to jail for that. CFOs, CEOs have to sign all the returns that they're acting in the interest of their shareholders, and that all their filings are correct and proper. and monopolizing parts of the world and acting like like a nascent like political body, a la, or in the spirit of East Germany. You don't put that on a balance sheet. You don't put that on an income statement. You don't put that on a cash flow statement. Um, I think a lot of these. This is just something I'll briefly bring up. A lot of these companies sidestep it by using subsidiaries, which I mentioned before, to get around it. So, as I said before, if you're a subsidiary owned by another company, if you're the CEO of the subsidiary company, which YouTube is to Google, which Reddit is to Condé Nast, which Vice Media is to like Disney and HBO, among other things. As long as you don't have shareholders per se. So, it's a lot of people aren't aware of this, but Disney is supposedly like completely acceptable. Everything we do isn't offensive or whatever. They own Vice Media, or they own 20% of Vice Media, and they put like they do an episode about some new way of smoking weed every single week. You think that like that has the Disney brand on it? Certainly normal Disney shareholders, like obviously there's a lot more at play here, but Disney itself would never do something like that. So if you're the CEO of or you're in charge of a privately owned subsidiary, you're only responsible to the company above you. So that sidesteps it. And so you'll notice that there's actually a pretty strong but not perfect correlation between companies that are public and actually do have, like, if you think about it, how shareholders vote for the directions of companies and the officers, it's a form of direct democracy. You'll notice that probably the most permissive, though they're by no means perfect, I'm not apologizing for Twitter, but the most permissive out of all the social media companies, in my opinion, these days is Twitter. And guess what? It's one of the few publicly traded ones. It seems like these days, I notice that like a lot of more fringe political guys, they actually talk on Facebook a lot. You notice that they're still allowed to operate there. That's another publicly held company. So maybe, just maybe, like the last vestiges of responsibility to shareholders are still being seen, like kind of this archaic vestigial aspect of business can still be seen in these public companies, but obviously it's rapidly changing. Versus Reddit just acts totally with total hypocrisy, and and who it bans and who it censors, and they're so blatant about it. And guess what? That's a privately owned subsidiary. So, is that the answer to everything? No, but I think that's an important thing to bring up, and definitely an aspect of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this juncture it probably might be pertinent to bring up the idea of sustainability, having talked about Soviet satellite states. I mean, 20. Hindsight's always 2020, or rather, everything's 2020 with hindsight. But so you can look back on history and think, well, the Soviet apparatus was doomed to fail. I'm wondering about the degree of long-term sustainability regarding this. For example, I made a video. It's about 2 years ago. I think it was something like the matter of justice. It was basically investigating the different ethical and social intuitions that men and women have, and how SW had taken 5 or 6 instances of paid maternity leave where she's effectively doing nothing for the company, and that can't be profitable, right? At all. I
think they have a legal responsibility to do that, though.
Yeah, but
it's a bigger example to some you could bring up, which I mentioned before this talk, and I think I've mentioned this before, and I'll be brief about this, is the Creators for Change thing, which is pushing ideology, and it's mandated to be on your homepage once a month, in case you haven't noticed. And this is a very basic thing. In theory, the homepage, if they're looking to maximize profits, should have high CPM, high advertising rate videos, and not videos about like political groups or ideologies. So I mean, that is, I think, a better example for outright deliberate, again, corporate management or management sponsored activities that do not at all work to maximize shareholder value or return profits. What were you going to say?
one of the elephants in the room, I think you mentioned Ellen Pao. There's a track record of women being at the helm, not exactly steering the ship in the right direction, so to speak. Not
Yeah.
doing a
So
good job.
the conventional line against that is that how that's explained in mainstream thought is that companies that are failing, this is, just hear me out on this one. Companies that are failing look to shake things up, to do something different, or companies that are having problems, and so usually they decide to appoint a woman as a change of pace, just to do something different. And so people argue there's a selection bias there. Not saying I agree either way on this, but they argue that there's a selection bias, and that's why more companies who have those changes in management tend to do poorly afterwards. Putting it out there for the sake of the record.
Yeah, yeah. But again, comparatively speaking, the proportion of female CEOs to male CEOs who don't appear to be doing their job is it's a bit strange. It might be selection bias, sample size too small,
definitely.
but it's
there's a long list. So Marissa Myers, Yahoo. Where's Yahoo today? Oops. Carly Fiorina, HP. Where's HP today? Oops. SW, YouTube. How's YouTube doing? It goes on and on and on. I think it was Theranos. I forget the CEO's name, but she, I need to look more into it, but she effectively committed fraud. She lied about, or she distorted the facts on I guess a blood testing technology. And long story on that. Certainly selection bias is likely at play, but there are plenty of examples. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It really gets the noggin jogging, wondering why so many women are artificially being put into place. I mean, let's be blunt here. SW got in purely for nepotic reasons, through nepotism, that is.
Oh yeah, I'm not afraid to say that at all. Her qualification, I mean, everyone can read the story. I think I talked about this on previous talks. She let the founders of Google use her garage. Okay? I think, anyone looking at this, no matter what angle they're approaching of, would not be impressed by SW's, displayed business acumen and also her track record. I mean, I said this before. She was in charge of Google Video. What happened to that? It failed. You had Google's backing, and you lost to YouTube, and then Google had to buy out the competition, and then put you in charge of it. It is ridiculous. It's like it's like you're in a car race, and the other car beats you by like 10 miles, and then the owner comes and switch cars with you so you can win. Right? And I'm sure you could think of a better example, but that's not a win. That's not a win at all. I think this is even just a mainstream thing going on YouTube. I wonder about how and why she became CEO of YouTube.
It's also a new form of nepotism in the sense that traditionally, stemming from the Latin word nepos, someone who's related, it's in some sense it's transcendent. That now there's a kind of ideological cultural nepotism. It helps if you're brown or just basically not white and a male, of course. But in general, they'll take anyone on who has a certain ideological bent, and I mean, I don't know the hiring process, but I mean, James Damore is a great example. The guy is obviously a big brain nibble. He's obviously competent, but you can't have him there because he expressed a view. I think he was trying to help the company. Basically, he was trying to sort of, I guess, partition up the work.
Whistleblower.
Yeah, whistleblower. I mean, I don't know if that was his intention, but he maybe thought it was odd that the more you toe the line. So if they have candidate, let's say all things are equal in terms of race, gender. You have candidate X and Y, but candidate X is more in favor of diversity hiring and turning the world into a pink elephant. That's definitely going to be the case that Google and YouTube would hire that person over the other person. And maybe even if Y had slightly better qualifications, that would also be an instance of, well, this person might be better at it, but we don't really care about competence. We want people who think like we do, which is classic nepotism. where you get this conflation of, yeah, they might be competent, someone else is more competent, but we're going to just go for the person who's more closely related to us, in this case in terms of the ideas and ideology. It doesn't help, of course, and this is a superficial criticism, that SW, when she speaks, sounds like a Valley Girl, completely inarticulate. Like, we're really trying to make the platform really open for everybody. Nah.
Well, don't judge a book by its cover.
Of course. But it's one wonders if this speech is somewhat artificial or it's masking some great mind. I'm inclined to doubt that, but yeah. So
I mean, Jake Paul. I'm not sure if you know who that is, but do you know who that is?
I'm unfamiliar.
Oh, Jake Paul. Okay, he's effectively a child entertainer. He's one of the bigger personalities on the site. You don't need to know him. He does not have a very intelligent way of speaking, but I don't think it's undeniable that he's at least above average. He's an intelligent guy.
Oh yeah,
you do have to factor in people playing an act, which is possible sometime. We don't know for sure with SW, and also just something about spending time in California and how you speak. It does make otherwise intelligent people seem a lot different, doesn't it?
The state to end all states, yeah.
Yeah. So what you're talking about, even just with SW and ideology, it's not just YouTube. There are audio leaks. I don't know if you heard about this. This was a few months ago. There were audio leaks released from some Google internal employee meeting after the election in 2016, and they're. I mean, the discussion is on par of what you would see or what you would hear at internal DNC meetings. They were saying, a lot of you are hurting right now. We have to realize that more of the country isn't thinking the way we are. We need to work to change that. This is a company saying that.
Yeah.
Again, like, not the DNC or not an exploratory committee for a politician. It is insane. I mean, your friend would think this is insane, even as of 10 years ago.
Well, it was a guy, it's not a friend, but a guy I met. Yeah, he would be shocked. Yeah. Versus Coca-Cola saying, the public is on to our campaign of lies, and we're destroying the people health. Let's figure out a way to bribe somebody in order to keep afloat and continue turning a profit, which would be understandable, even if I don't think it's in the best interest of the people. Yeah, absolutely. I guess as we move towards the end, egress or way out seems to be. Well, I'm just skeptical that there is any way out of this, and the idea that it doesn't have an impact on. I think it does. I mean, it's obviously bleeding into public life, whether it's the Kavanaugh affair. You mentioned Mike Pence. It's taken a while, but the culture war being waged on the internet does have an impact. And the thing with normies in particular is they're very susceptible to whatever flies their way. So if it's written in the ether that you're supposed to behave a certain way, then that writing happens to be of the sort that we've been discussing, it's going to create a massive cultural shift over time. I think we're heading towards that already, and whatever resistance exists to that is minimal, doesn't have a lot of backup, and oftentimes, I don't want to. It often is just way too extreme. I'm not going to mention the incident because one needs to be aware of the channel, but we all know about a very recent incident that was just effectively the act of a lunatic. I think you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes.
And that doesn't help anything. So it does feel very much like an inescapable situation, and that people like myself and others, we're just going to have to go down with the ship, basically.
Both sides are putting pressure on each other, and two sides putting pressure against each other. In this case, whether it's the middle orders of society versus the higher or whatever, you've always been about identifying trends and forces and working to see where they end up inevitably. And I agree in your conclusion. It's not looking good.
No. Someone whose main purpose is cataloging the state of affairs in the world. It's definitely not. Of course, in Europe, people worry about Article 13, which they're going to be, I think, voting on the final form come February. And some people are incredibly worried, some other people aren't. It's debatable what the real consequences will be and how enforceable it all will be, but it's, yeah. Although, I want, in terms of collusion, I mean, the EU is, they're their own version of kind of a new Sovietism, if you will.
Yes.
Yeah. One wonders, because in the case of something like that, the pressure is being put on companies and what have you. So, there might be some push and pull there. I don't really know.
Yeah, not to deviate too from the egress, as you called it. There definitely is a push and pull going on there. So you remember the incident with Merkel and the hot mic on Zuckerberg when she was, issuing orders to him, almost in a stern.
And Sugar Mountain sense. And Sugar Mountain was just nodding his head like a lackey. Yeah, we're working on new ways of. Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, well, I noticed on Twitter and even SW tweeted about this. YouTube is really upset. I mean, at the management level about Article 13. They're imploring their users to oppose it, and again, even SW personally tweeted out about how it would be bad for creators. Makes me wonder, enemy of my enemy.
Right. Well, and the funny thing about it is that Article 13, it's not just for meme lords. I mean, the sort of milquetoast, look at my fluffy kittens, I'm a feminist, whatever sort of thing, they could be affected too, potentially. So this is going to be an interesting thing going forward to observe, to see this clash of the titans. A Soviet-style bureaucracy filled with apparatchiks and what have you, that have
versus U.S. tech plutocracy,
largely not been voted in. Yeah, versus that, and who's going to win out in the end? I'm not entirely sure, but the problem is neither of these guys are good for you. It's I'm trying to think of a good historical analogy of two powers at war with each other, and you're just kind of stuck in the middle.
Have you seen Babylon 5?
Many years ago. I don't recall too much about it.
Shadows versus the Vorlons.
Right. Okay. Yeah, but I mean, this is just, you're dealing with two overlords that don't really wish you well at the same time. In this case, in theory, you would want to be on YouTube's side, just so you can continue with business as usual.
YouTube wants a lot of people I like driven away. I don't have any sympathy for them.
Right, but at the same time, if you're operating on a YouTube platform, the internet, the potential consequences.
That's the problem.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe it's an instance of dealing with the devil you know rather than the devil you don't know. We're pretty familiar with the current satanic powers, as it were. And do we really want to add new forms of sorcery and black magic to it? I don't know. I'm kind of inclined to say no. Because...
Yeah, I hate picking between rat poison and rhododendron. I'm definitely inclined to lean towards YouTube for the same reasons you said. We know, people know how to contend with it. I know each cycle it gets harder and harder and harder, but even still, the people around today, they know how to contend with it, and they still somehow hold on.
Somehow. Adrift on a piece of wood in the ocean, being flanked by waves. Eventually, we'll go down, but for now, we're still here. And, I think we covered most of the material. I hope the conversation was educational and interesting to the audience. And I'm going to thank my friend for joining me again and giving us the lowdown on some of these details as he functionally analyzes YouTube for a living. So, thanks for joining me. And if in the future we could make use of your services, we'd be very grateful.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Okay. Everyone, thanks for joining me, and I'll check you out at a later date if I'm still live. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.